Good morning. Hello again. My name's Joel, if we haven't yet met, and it's great to be together again today. If you're joining us online, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're here in the room, thank you for being here in the room as well. I want to ask you a question. I've got my phone out for a reason. I'd like you to raise your hand for me if you have done something for me. And if you're online, you can just give a little thumbs up in the chat. So have you taken a selfie this week? Raise your hand for me. Be honest, it's okay. So come on, okay? And if you use Snapchat and you've done that little message with a snap, that counts, okay? So have you taken a selfie? Now, have you been involved in a group selfie? Right. Now, have you taken a selfie today? Have you taken a selfie today? Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. Sorry, there's no shame here. We love everybody. Yeah. It's funny how, I don't know if you noticed, anyone, the only people who raised their hands to say they had done it today was on the younger end of our population. So just stating. But I just got a little trivia question for you. Do you know who took the first selfie as a teenager? So who took the first teenage selfie? It's not actually the first self photograph ever, but who was the first teenager? Do you know when that was that took a selfie? Great trivia question. It was in 1914. It was, believe it or not, yeah. And it was the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia, the daughter of the Empress. So, and we have a little photo of it here, and she actually wrote about it to her dad. She wrote this to her father. She said, "I took this picture of myself looking in the mirror. It was very hard, and my hands were trembling." That's the first recorded teenager ever taking a selfie back in 1914 at the age of 13. A young Anastasia Romanov, part of the Russian court with Rasputin. So that's the family she was part of. Pretty crazy, huh? Now, there's a number of reasons, of course, why selfies are popular today. Of course, the rise of social media. Can you just do another quick survey? If you're on social media, any of the channels, can you just raise your hand for me? So there's Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook. Whoa, man, I'm making new ones up. Weibo, FaceChat, yeah. Snapgram, InstaTalk, Weibo, Telegram. I mean, there's tons of them. There's a lot of them. And, a lot of people use more than one platform as well. So if you use more than one platform, can you just raise your hand for me? So, yeah, I mean, it's very uncommon for most people to use it who aren't just on one sole sort of social media channel. But that's a big influence, of course, why there's that going on today. There's the advances of technology. Most of us have phones that do significantly more than they ever did years ago. Our phones can do thousands of things. And, years ago they didn't. Years ago your phone was not your camera plus your video recorder plus, yeah. And it's a cultural change. If you think about this, our generation, the generation coming up, the generation growing now, is the first generation that is living in an environment where they record every bit of their lives 24/7. So the younger generation growing up, they're the first generation to have experienced this. So if you could just cast your mind back, if you're a little bit older than me, no. If you're a little bit older, when our friends went on holiday, we only found out about it after we saw them again on the first day of school. Hey, what did you do over the summer? What did you do? Yeah. And I didn't really ask to see their pictures. I can never for the life of me ever asking one of my friends at school to see their photographs of the hotel room and the food they had. And this is where we went on the day out. And this is what we did here. I cannot even for the life of me ever imagine wanting any remote interest in all of that mundane stuff. But our children and our youth are growing up in a world where they know what's happening while their friends are on holiday the moment it's happening. I got a photograph from a friend yesterday. They're on the plane, they're in the airport, and he's like, I'm on my way to Atlanta. Yeah, thanks, rub it in, It's like, okay. Yeah, I don't really want to see photographs of you sitting on an airplane seat. Okay, just saying. So it's cultural as well. Selfies, of course, are very popular culturally. And I kind of think to myself, this is where my brain goes, but I sort of think to myself, wouldn't it be really cool if the disciples had selfies? So if we had moments with Jesus, it'd be like Matthew would be all like, heavy day at the office, it's tax return day, what would be people saying? Peter and James and John, they were all fishermen, of course, and they would be like, yeah, I caught a fish, it was this big. And then someone else would reply saying, how big? And you'd be like, just think about it. What if they took photographs, and here we are, and this is where, and look, he's walking on water, the dude's walking on water. Just think about it. It would be kind of crazy if it ever happened. But when we think of what the disciples looked like, because we don't really know what they looked like, because there weren't any photographs back then, we had some paintings. And I want to show you a couple of really famous paintings by a guy named Rubens. You can see lots of his work in the National Gallery in London. And he painted a whole series of the 12 apostles. And these are kind of what we think of. If you imagine the disciples or the first apostles, the first followers of Jesus, look at whoa. This is in ascending order. This is Andrew. Andrew, Peter, and Philip, runway models, look out, here we come, right? I don't know if you imagine the disciples, did the first thing you think of was like an old bearded white man with a receding hairline? Oh yeah. Sorry, we love you. They weren't white, for goodness sake, lived in the Middle East. But anyway, and we imagine these old people. And Jesus actually wasn't running around the countryside with a bunch of old people. He wasn't. And we're going to look at that just this morning. And I'm really excited our young people are in here this morning. And the reality is the first followers of Jesus were closer to their age than our age. The first follower of Jesus were, in all likelihood, most commentators, most people who research it, they say they actually were most all under the age of 18. It's possible. Some could have been as young as 13. And it changes things a lot. Of course, nowadays, we don't let children at the age of 13 work and go out and get jobs, but you did then. So, there's some cultural changes, of course. But it's crazy. Now, we do know, because Luke tells us in Luke 3, Luke tells us how old Jesus is. And Luke says, Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. Luke gives us this clue. Now, in the Jewish culture, the Jewish sort of tradition of teaching and a rabbi, and someone was a rabbi, which is kind of an old-fashioned word for just being teacher or headmaster, teacher, headmaster, professor, rabbi. So what that meant was, and when they started, they always started around the age of 30. It wasn't until you were the age of 30 that you were deemed mature enough to actually become a rabbi yourself. So this is what Luke's telling us culturally. He's also saying, Jesus started his ministry about the age of 30, which was typical for anyone who was becoming a rabbi. So this is what Luke said. But we don't get anything of that for the disciples. There's no record in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. There's no birthday party that Martha's throwing for Mary. There's no hey, it's the big 18. Peter's 18 years old now. Finally, he's an adult, Will he ever mature? Who knows? Anyway, we don't have any of these kind of things. So what we have to look at is cultural or contextual clues. And I just want to look at just some of the clues. So in that day and age, because culturally, when you were in education, if you were a young Jewish boy, you would study in a house of study or where you studied, and you focused mainly on the scriptures. And it wasn't the Bible like we think of today. It was the first 5 books of the Bible. That's what they studied. That's the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those first 5 books are the ones that they studied. Those are the ones that they focused on. So when they study the scriptures, it doesn't mean there was no Bible, okay? That didn't exist for hundreds of years until after Jesus died. So there wasn't the Bible that you might be holding in your hand today or on your phone. So they studied in this school. And what would happen was you'd study in that school up until the age of 13. And at the age of 13, you would leave that school You'd have your bar mitzvah, you'd become a man, if you like. And what would happen is you would leave that school unless you were the brightest of the bright. And you were the best of the best. You were the smartest of the bunch. You were the most academic. Only if you showed the greatest potential would you stay in the house of study. Otherwise, you would move on. And what you would do when you would move on is get in a trade. You'd do an apprentice. So you would work possibly with a family business, more than likely the family business, or you'd get an apprenticeship with somebody else from your village or your community. And so that's what unless you were the best of the best, the brightest of the bunch, unless you were one of those students, you would have moved on from your education. Okay, so you didn't sort of stay on and then do GCSEs and then A-levels and then go to university. It wasn't a sequential thing. It was only if you were capable and competent enough. And if you showed potential and the hope that a rabbi would one day choose you, you would stay at one of these schools. And that's what we know from history and from Jewish culture. So none of the disciples were in that setting. So they were already out of that school system. So we know as a clue, they weren't still in that educational system. We also know as a clue, James and John are fishermen who are working with their dad, because when Jesus first calls them to follow him, they're working with their father. They weren't running their own business as of yet. So by all aspects, they were younger. And they think of Apostle John was the youngest one of the bunch. And that's why he's numerous times described in almost endearing, almost childlike terms as well. This is John, and that he could have been the one that might have been even as young as 13, 14 years old. And he's known as the youngest of the bunch. Here's another little clue. So we know that rabbis didn't have students who were older than them, because that's kind of weird. If you've ever done a training thing at your work or maybe in education, and you go in and you're supposed to be the teacher and the room is full of people who are a lot older than you, that's a bit different. And even our own education system, you know that that's the way it works. Most people who are teachers go into classrooms and they teach people who are younger than them. Until you get to university, and it's almost peer level, and you've almost got maybe research or doctorate studies. Unless you go further up the academic tree, it just works that way, doesn't it? Most students have people who are younger than them. So we know Jesus was 30, and we know that, well, actually, it would be kind of weird to have people who are older than you to be your students, your followers, if you like. It just didn't happen culturally. So we've got that as a clue. We also know that the way they describe their relationship with Jesus, they always use the terminology of master, which is like headmaster. That's the sort of connotation. It's not like master of the universe. It's like headmaster. It's sort of like that sort of connotation, or rabbi, which is like teacher. And they refer to themselves as student-pupils, teacher-pupil relationship. That's how they describe themselves all the time. That's how they're described by other people. Other people say to Jesus, hey, your pupils don't do this. Your students don't do that. How come your children don't do this? That's how they're talked about by other people in that setting. So there's another little clue. We also know that of the disciples who first followed Jesus, the only one that's actually mentioned as being married is Peter. Peter's the only one who had a wife. As far as we know, the others weren't. And so we're like, we don't know. And so what happened was, with Peter, the reason we know he was married is because his mother-in-law is sick, and Jesus healed her. And so, but we also know, culturally, if you step out into history and look at the first century history and the first century Judaism culture, you got married around the age of 20. And so what happened is you'd be in your trade from the age of 13, you'd work, and your apprenticeship. Around the age of 18, roughly, you'd have been mature enough to run your own company, your own business, your own skills. You could start preparing for the next steps, and you'd be building to the next steps when you're about 20, and that's when you roughly got married. Now, the other reason 20 was a big deal, or that 20 was an age that meant something, was according to the Jewish tax system, you didn't pay taxes until the age of 20. So when you became 20, that's when you started to pay your taxes, right? So if any of you are working and you're under the age of 20, you're sort of thinking, Yeah, that'd be kind of cool. I'd like that. But listen to this. There's this moment when Jesus is talking to Peter, and he tells him to go do some fishing, yeah? And he tells him to go get a fish, and when you catch the fish, you're going to open the fish, and then this is a crazy story if you've never heard this. The guy goes fishing, he pulls in a fish, the fish has a coin in its mouth, and Jesus says to him, take the first fish that you catch, you open its mouth, you'll find the coin, and use it to pay my taxes and yours. So we know Peter was older. Peter was old enough to get married. And by all accounts, you're paying taxes because there was a big discussion about taxes. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. So we know that they're the only two that were paying taxes. So it's likely that Peter was the only one out of the whole bunch that was even old enough to pay taxes. That's why I say the average would have been lower. There's another story, you might have heard the story, which is kind of embarrassing. So there was this moment where James and John were with Jesus, and guess who came with them to ask Jesus something? Their mom. Right? Okay. Now, at what age were you when your mom stopped interfering in your life? Okay, maybe she still does, God bless her. I don't know. At what age did your mom stop going with you somewhere and sort of defending you and trying to make something happen for you? And she goes to Jesus and she petitions Jesus to let her two sons be on the right and left hand, if they could be like Jesus, because they're young, because they would have been apprenticing, they would have been working with their father, learning the business. So now she wants them to apprentice with Jesus. And she's like, come on, can you help them? Can they be your right hand men? Can they be the two that come along with you? Can they, and she just gets kind of, isn't the Bible so funny how honest it is? But we kind of forget that only would have happened if you were young enough for your mom to still do that. So we got lots of clues that the first followers of Jesus were much younger and probably all under the age of 18 except for Peter. And I just want you to take a moment, cast your mind back. Now for some of us, this is harder than for others. Remember when you were a teenager? Now, you might be a teenager this morning, which is really easy for you to do this. But for some of the other people in the room, we don't think as quickly as you. So we've got to give us a moment to remind ourselves what it was like before we had to pay bills and before we had to do all the other stuff that we have to do, right? When life seems so wonderful and fun and easy. Yes, I know that's not maybe how you think about it, but that's how we think about it. So cast your mind back to if you were a young teenager under the age of 18. And could you imagine being one of the first followers of Jesus as a teenager? As a young person? Could you imagine that? I mean, what an adventure. It would be such an adventure, wouldn't it? And here you are, this group of people, you've been brought together. You're all from different backgrounds. Some of you have got occupation. Some of you have been training longer than others. Some of you are still learning. Some of you are more academic, some of you are more practical, some of you are more strategic. Some of you had more wealth, some of you had less wealth. We know that Matthew was a tax collector. So we know that he would have been used to running and working in more of a business, much more than some of the others. So such a mix of people, and you're only brought together because of one thing. This charismatic leader, this dynamic person that's brought you together as this group. You're the young guns, you're the motley crew, you're the band of brothers. Think about the banter and the vibe and the stuff that would have just gone on. This guy challenged you. Jesus challenges you. He provokes you. He makes you think differently. Remember when you were a teenager, maybe it was when you first went to university and you had a professor and he or she started asking you questions and challenging you in different ways and you think differently? Or maybe you had your first job and you began to have to think differently and do things differently. Can you remember those days? Can you remember having to think on your feet and be really responsive to situations around you? This is what they're experiencing all the time with Jesus. They're learning new skills. Do you remember when you were younger, maybe you were in art, or maybe you were in academia, maybe you're a musician, maybe whatever you were studying, whatever you were into. Do you remember when you were younger and you were still learning your craft? That's the stage that these guys are at. And it must have been so exciting to have seen the miracles, stuff that was so unexpected that the only way you could describe it is miraculous or supernatural or signs. That's the only way you could actually put into words. Just think, what would you have felt like if you were there on a boat and it was stormy, and then all of a sudden it's not a storm anymore because Jesus told the wind and the wave to be still? Or what would you feel like if you were there and you saw him walking on the water, if you saw him spit in the mud and heal somebody, if you were there and he was teaching and all of a sudden in the middle of his teaching, stuff starts falling from the ceiling and you wonder what in the world's going on, and people have begun to rip a hole in the roof just to drop a lame, paralyzed man down into the middle and interrupt the whole thing. Just imagine the interruption right now if something came right down through the middle of this room and some dude was on a stretcher right in the middle of the room. Okay, this was like, you couldn't write this stuff. I mean, you couldn't even imagine it. That's what they're living in. They're experiencing this stuff that's just so crazy. What about the trouble he caused? He goes into the temple, one of the most sacred places, and he kicks over tables and he flips market stuff over and he disrupts everything. He makes a whip out of leather and he makes such a scene. How about the time when he gets threatened they're going to try to stone him and he has to disappear in the crowd? There's another time they're going to take him to the edge of a cliff and throw him off and they can't find him. There's people threatening to kill him. And here you are, a young teenager, and it's just like, oh my word, this is crazy. How did we ever get out of this situation? And if you look at the life of Jesus, you begin to realize the way he traveled and the way he moved and the geography in Israel. He would sort of go to Jerusalem, cause trouble, and then disappear. So it's up and down, up and down. And that's what happens. That's the pattern that happens over and over and over again. And eventually he goes to Jerusalem the last time, and that's when everything really gets crazy. Because he arrives, he gets on this donkey that he's asked you to find for him. And as he's riding in the middle of the city, music is there. People begin to hear the rumors. It's that Jesus guy. It's Jesus. Jesus is here. You know, the one that brought Lazarus back to life? Who, by the way, was probably not an old man either. To have Mary, Martha, and Lazarus living together, 3 single adults, is probably unlikely unless they were a widow and living with their brother. It's more likely that they were younger. Jesus talks about them in endearing terms. Martha says, how come my sister isn't helping me with the dishes? Is that the sort of thing you would say as a mature adult? It's more like what happens in my house, let me tell you that. It's more likely Martha was a young teenager herself and says to Jesus, where in the world were you when my brother was sick? And no wonder it says Jesus loved them because it's like these are this family, this group of young people. Yeah. So even commentators expect that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were much younger than we traditionally think. Anyway, so here he is. He's riding in Jerusalem. All of a sudden there's this noise and this rumor that Jesus is in town, and it's going crazy, and the crowd begins to hear of it, and they're laying down blankets and they're laying down palm trees, and he's riding through the middle of Jerusalem, and they're singing songs about him. I mean, could you, here we're back in Jerusalem. People told us not to go here because it was dangerous, but here we are, and instead of it being dangerous, guess what's happening? The whole place is throwing a party because Jesus is here. Except 4 days later, everything changed. This is why it was so unexpected for the followers of Jesus. These first followers of Jesus, everything changed. 4 days later, he's arrested, he's put on trial, he's beaten, and he's put to death. The point from when he gets arrested and then put to death all happens in 24 hours. 24 hours. Your life, your world, everything changed. In 24 hours, it all changed. And Jesus wasn't just told off. He wasn't handed a fine. He wasn't told to do community service, go shovel out some camel dung for the next 30 days. And, he wasn't just slapped on the wrist. The authorities wanted him done with. Literally. They wanted him out of there. And they conspired and they got together, and Jesus was terminated. He was put to death, literally. Now, can you imagine? Go back to that teenage moment in your life. Or maybe you're a teenager, so you already know this is easy for you. But just, could you imagine how much things would have changed in just a few short days? Some of us can actually think of something happening like that because a couple years ago something happened called COVID, and all of a sudden we had an announcement and immediate lockdowns, and your education system changed, and your work patterns changed, and your social life changed. Everything changed in an instant. And you can kind of get an idea about how radical and how momentous some huge change was. This is what it was like. This was a huge, huge, huge change for them. But could you imagine how upset and disappointed they would have been? It'd been much greater than being disappointed that you can't go on holiday, or you can't have the birthday party that you'd planned, or you can't do the event that you'd planned. But it's actually your great, charismatic, dynamic leader that you looked up to, that you gave everything to, that you left your careers for, that you left your apprenticeships for, that you gave up everything for, is now gone. And you have no clue what to do next. No clue what to do next because you've left everything else behind. You don't know, what do we do now? You can imagine like the fear. Imagine just being a 13, 14-year-old who was a follower of Jesus. You've just now seen things change in a moment because you can still remember the crowd chanting Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest 4 days ago, and you could hardly move to the city of Jerusalem because it was so crowded and everybody was so excited that Jesus was there. You can still remember that. You can still remember what they were singing, and then you can also remember in 4 short days they're screaming his name to be crucified and put to death. How do you process that? You know, do you remember being a young person and all of a sudden something happens in your life which makes you view life differently? You ever had that happen? You have this hope and this maybe innocence and this imagination and this excitement, and then something happened which actually changed the way you viewed life. You know, I mean, what a wake-up call. What a reality call for this group of young people to find out the way the world can really be. To see the best person ever in your life get treated the worst possible way. To see people change in an instant from a celebratory crowd to a mob screaming for somebody's blood. They're experiencing it firsthand, just like people around the world are doing the same thing. They're experiencing it. Neighbors turning against neighbors in countries where wars are going on, right? All of a sudden you can't imagine, well, why are they treating us this way? What's happened? Well, what's going on? Could you imagine the fear? So of course, this group of young teenagers, of course they're hiding. What else would you do? I go to the bottom of a cellar in a steel plant somewhere just to find myself safe. Safe. And that's what they do. They hide. Of course they hide. Because they don't know what's going on in their world. Everything has turned upside down. And could you imagine how hopeless you would feel? You could just imagine it. Just imagine the hopelessness of this excitement and this desire and then everything changing. Can you imagine that hopelessness? Can you imagine not even knowing what to do, where to go? What do we do now? What do we do now? Jesus is dead. Maybe some of you can imagine some of these feelings easier than us. Did you know in 2020 the Prince's Trust did some research, and I'm only going to give you the data from their answers in the Southeast. And this research was done for the ages of 16 to 25. So if you didn't get asked any of these questions, that's because you're probably too old. 57% of people between the ages 16 to 25 in the Southeast said they were scared about unemployment. 43% said they were worried they would never get a job. 36% said their future goals now seemed impossible to achieve. 32% said they feel they will never succeed in life. 36% said they've abandoned aspirations for the future. 40% said their hope for the future is significantly lower due to the pandemic. Mental Health Foundation said that the highest rating results for people answering the question, I have felt significant loneliness in the last 4 weeks. For people between the ages of 16 and 24, 42% of people said yes. The highest demographic of any group of people in the UK that said they have felt significant loneliness within the last 4 weeks are those aged between 16 and 24. It's very sad. And this isn't old data. This is all within the last 18 months to 2 years. I mean, it's not foreign data. It's not from some country, some other place. And as I say, we filtered the Prince's Trust Research to just the southeast. This is the stuff on our doorstep, guys. So yeah, maybe you can imagine as a young person not knowing what the future would look like. Maybe you can imagine. Maybe it's easy for you to think like that. Because maybe you do feel like that. Maybe. You know? So, I mean, is this where the story ends? Is this how Jesus left them? Is this how the story stops? That's it. Some of them thought so. Peter, who used to be a fisherman, said, hey guys, let's just go fishing. And a whole group of them went with them because they don't know what else to do. You know, but what happened next for this young band of followers, this motley crew, this whole group of young teenage boys and girls? What happened next gave them a hope to face whatever they could face in the future. What happened next actually gave them a new perspective on life, which was bigger than the one they just had, by seeing a multitude of people celebrate your name and then 4 days later cry out for your blood. It gave them a perspective that was bigger than the cruelty that they experienced. They had a perspective that was bigger than the injustice they experienced. They got a perspective that was bigger than all of the violation that they had experienced by watching an innocent person be put to death for committing no crime. Something happened. You don't even have to be a follower of Jesus to agree something happened, because somehow, thousands of years later, we are still talking about the something that happened. Something happened. And Peter, who was one of these guys, one of these early followers, the guy that went fishing and pulled out a coin just so he could pay his taxes, Peter himself writes this, and he looks back and he says this. He says, praise to God, because in his great mercy, he has given us a living hope. Why? How? Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. This whole series we're looking at, Because He Lives, is all hinged on the very fact the only reason we have hope for the future is the same thing as Peter saying. The only thing that we have a living hope, the only reason we have a living hope is because He lives. Maybe the whole idea of somebody coming back from the dead is far-fetched, because let's be honest, it is. Maybe it's more like Harry Potter films or superhero stories or novels or books. I mean, maybe the whole idea of somebody actually coming back from the dead is really bizarre and really, come on, it doesn't happen, does it? Yeah, I've known lots of people who've died and not one of them have come back. I'm going to guarantee that's probably your experience as well. Just saying. And maybe you doubt, and that's okay. And it would be really understandable if you doubt. You're in the best company ever, because every single one of Jesus's followers doubted. Every single one of his close friends didn't believe it. And of course they didn't believe it. Dead people stay dead. Of course they didn't believe it, right? And then Jesus starts to show up again. Okay, this is like a really quick story. Jesus starts showing up again after he's been killed. And guess what? They still don't believe it. They still don't believe it. It's like, they just don't believe it. He goes out of his way to help them believe. He shows up 10 different times, maybe more, but there's 10 different times recorded where he shows up and like, it's really me. Oh, it's really, really me. Yes, I'm really, really back. 10 different times he has to show up and come to these followers of Jesus. 10 times. He shows up and he helps them with their unbelief. It's like he even goes out of their way. I love what Richard said earlier. There's even one time he says he breathes on them. So in John 20, he breathes on them. It's like he's going out of his way to prove that he's really there. Just take your hand for me, put it in front of your mouth, and then I just want to check you're still alive. Are you alive? Are you breathing? So Jesus is there, and they're freaking out, because you would freak out because you saw him get treated in the worst possible way, and you saw him die. You saw him die. And he shows up, and he's like, I'm really here. You're not imagining this. And I'm not going to come and do this because it'd be a bit weird and intimate, but he came in and he breathed on them. Yeah? I'm sure you wouldn't want me to come over. You can tell I'm alive. Yeah, you can tell I'm here. You don't need me to come and like be close enough to like, how are you? I had Italian last night with extra garlic. Can you tell? No, he breathed on people, you know? And when people breathe on you, they got to be close enough for you to feel the breath or smell their breaths. I mean, so Jesus isn't from the other side of the room going, I'm here, guys. Yeah, just think you got, you know, read the Bible like it's a real story because it's real people writing about real events. And Jesus is there and he's with his followers and he's like, I'm really, really here. You can feel my breath. I'm really, really here. I'm really, really here. You can touch me. Go ahead, feel me. Feel my hands. Feel my side. A couple of times he's recorded it, encouraging people to feel his scars, to feel his wounds, to actually touch. Pretty incredible. I love this one in Luke. It says, Jesus immediately stood in front of them. And he says, peace be unto you, which of course he says that because you'd freak out, wouldn't you? They were startled and frightened, thinking they had seen a ghost. See, they didn't believe it. They thought it was just some weird trickery, yeah? Man, who made this food? Like, what did you guys put in this stew? I don't know. So they're like, oh, they think they're seeing a ghost. And Jesus is like, why are you troubled? Why are you doubting? It's okay. Why are you troubled? Why are you doubting? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. Touch me and see me. A ghost does not have flesh and bone. Then he showed them his hands and his feet. And guess what? Well, they still did not believe it. I told you were in really good company. I told you if you got doubts or questions or you're not really sure about this whole Jesus and faith thing, you are in the best company because even they didn't believe it and they're flipping touching his hands, okay? They couldn't believe it. It's like, and it says because of joy and amazement, meaning like they can't believe it. It's just so unexpected. It's too good to be true. What? No, it's not, no, okay? That's not me telling you, oh, there's a letter in the post and it just said that they found out you're the long-lost heir of like Henry VIII. And actually there's been a mistake and you should be on the throne. So we're going to have to like, you know, do the whole rejig of the royal family. So actually you're now king of England. What? What? Okay. I've just won 180 million on the Euro lottery. What? Did I buy a ticket? Was that what really? Oh, utter joy and amazement. That's what it means. They can't comprehend it because it's like, what? Huh? Utter joy. And then he asks him if he asks them, have you got anything I can eat? I mean, why is Jesus going out of his way to try to convince them that he's really there? Why is he just going out of his way again and again? And they gave him a piece of grilled fish, which he took and he ate it in front of them. Isn't that cool? I just love that one. You know, in John 21, a similar event happens. Jesus is appearing to them. This is the third time he's appeared to them. They've all gone back out. A group of them have decided to go fishing, and they couldn't catch anything. And then Jesus says, chuck your net on the other side, and they do it, and they pull in a whole load of fish. And then the penny drops. Duh. I mean, sometimes you think, how could you guys have not noticed beforehand? You know, here they are fishing, and then Jesus says, hey guys, have you caught anything? And they say, no, we haven't caught anything. We've been here all night. I can't believe it. Why don't you try the other side? And they do it, which is the same thing that happened years earlier. And then they pull in this net, and there's like, whoa, there's loads of fish. Hey, this is crazy. And then like, wait a minute, it's Jesus. Yeah, you idiots. Right? Of course it is. Right? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, that's just where my brain went with the story. So he's there. And what is he doing? He's got a fire going because they're going to eat together. They're going to spend some time having a meal. And what I love about this story, what I love about all of these instances, every single time Jesus shows up, for these doubters, these cynics, these unbelievers. Every time Jesus shows up to those people, he never tells them off. He never tells them how stupid they are. He never tells them, why didn't you just have more faith? Why didn't you just believe more? As if you could somehow sort of stir something up. He didn't do any of that. In fact, he kind of does the opposite. In every instance, he meets them where they are. And he doesn't ridicule them. He doesn't make them feel like they failed. He doesn't make them feel like they did something wrong. He actually does something totally different. And what he does is this. I wrote it down like this. He doesn't berate because he wants to relate. He sits down and he has food with them. He's close enough to breathe. He's close enough that they can touch his hands and feel his scars and feel his wounds. He doesn't want to berate. He wants to relate. And the other thing he doesn't do, which is interesting, he doesn't just give them information. There's not facts and figures. There's not data points. He doesn't try to educate. He just wants to relate. He doesn't berate you, and he doesn't just try to educate you. More than anything, he wants to relate with you. And it's interesting that Jesus' primary focus on encouraging people to grow in their faith was through one filter alone: relationship. It's interesting because now psychologists and data now says this is from a book recently written in 2020, and I'll just read the quote, and they write, it's from the Oxford Press, and it says, "It is crucial that you have warm and affirming relationships. You can be intentional and invested in communicating religious ideas, but if you are emotionally distant or critical in your relationship, it is likely your efforts will fail." This is on the back of some recent studies, done some data in the US, and they're studying how do children or young people grow up in faith. Why does it seem to sort of work for some and not work for others? And this is one of their finding summary points, that if your approach is emotionally distant or critical, your efforts are likely to fail. Isn't it interesting that Jesus didn't meet any of his people by being emotionally distant or critical? He didn't write them off for all of their unbelief, all of their doubt, all of their confusion, all of their questions, all of their uncertainty. Not a single one of them were written off, because he didn't come to berate, he came to relate. And he didn't come to just educate, he came to relate. And we're going to close now. And we're going to put a worship song on in a moment, and we're also going to have communion together. And communion is like bread and wine, little bits of a meal, if you like, a simple meal, very simple meal, something to eat and something to drink. Because out of everything that Jesus did, he came to show himself through the context of a meal, where he ate with people and spent time with people, because his focus was relating with you, relating with us. And Jesus allowed himself to be vulnerable. He showed people his scars. He was honest where he was feeling what was going on. And if you work with young people, if you're in a small group, or I'd encourage you. Maybe if you're a parent of children yourself, why don't you begin to think, oh, how am I being, emotionally supportive of my children? Or am I more critical than anything? How are you doing? How are we doing? Jesus affirms us. He works with our doubts. And so I want to invite you in a moment. We're going to just share the bread and the wine, bread and the juice together. And just want to encourage you that more than anything, Jesus came to affirm you and spend time with you. And the thing was, and they wrote this at the end of their lives, these disciples wrote that the only thing that gives them a living hope is through the resurrection of Jesus. That was the only thing. That was the only thing that changed everything for them. That was the only thing that changed their entire perspective. It was so important for them that Paul said this, didn't he? He said, if the resurrection, if Jesus didn't come back from the dead, then everything is worthless. Your faith is nothing. Everything else is worthless if Jesus didn't come back from the dead. That's how big of a deal this was for them. Huge deal. So we're going to close now. We can go ahead and start that song for us as well. That's cool. And I just want to close that Jesus came to a time when his young followers faced a future full of uncertainty and anxiety. When his young teenage followers did not know what the future held. He met them where they were, and he meets us where we are. And if you've got doubts and questions about Jesus, you are in the absolute best place you can be. You're the same place that every single one of his first followers were. We're all in the same thing together. So as we start this song and get ready to take communion, I want to invite you to bring your fears. I want to invite you to bring your anxieties, bring your confusion, bring your questions, bring your uncertainties, bring your worries, bring everything to the table. And remember the one who came to meet you where you are and relate to you. Simple bit of bread and juice to remind us that more than anything, Jesus came to relate. I invite you to put your trust in Jesus. I want to pray now as we close. Jesus, thank you so much that you, more than anything, came to relate to us. Thank you for inviting us as young, excited people. Thank you for inviting us with our confusions, our doubts, our hurts, our disappointments. Thank you for inviting us. And thank you that more than anything, you came to be with us. In your name we pray. Amen. Feel free, please, to just come on your own timing, just as this song plays.
He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives.
But sweeter still, the calm assurance
This child can face uncertain days because he lives. because he lives.
And life is worth the living just because he lives.
I pray that whatever you're facing, either this week or in your life right now, that you know that life is worth the living. Not because everything's perfect, not because everything's worked out, not because all the debts have been paid, or not because all that stuff that you've got going on in your life has been resolved, but it's worth the living just because he lives. That's what the first followers said. That was the only thing that made anything worth living for. We'd love to journey with you. We'd love to walk with you. If there's anything we can do for you, please let us know. If you're in a small group, connect in your small groups as well. Share what's going on in your lives. If you want to pray with someone today, we're here available to pray with you as well. And if you're just exploring what it means to follow Jesus, we'd love to journey with you. If you have any questions, come and see us afterwards, or also find out more about the Alpha course, which starts this Tuesday. Have an awesome, amazing rest of the week, and know that you are loved. And whatever you felt about God before, he didn't come to tell you off. He didn't come to be critical, but he came to relate. Have an awesome, life, hope-filled week. And we'll see you next Sunday.